Supposedly, there is some sort of sporting event going on later today. Something like the Hockey World Series, or... No, I know what the Super Bowl is. I just don't care because go Bears. Anyway, what is the biggest risk that you've ever taken before? Have you ever thought about that? Sometimes God calls us to step out of our comfort zone, step out of what's normal, what's usual for us, to go or to do or to attempt something that is maybe more than we are. Maybe you feel like God's calling you something like, I need to change jobs. Or maybe God's wanting you to shift career paths entirely. Maybe you're called to go back to school, or you're supposed to, move to a different region of the country. See, sometimes God calls us to risk something, to step out in faith, even when it might not make sense to anyone, maybe even yourself included. Whenever I was getting ready to graduate high school, I was starting to look at different colleges, and I'd done my research and finding out where to go in terms of getting ready for vocational ministry and things like that. And I ended up landing on two specific schools that I wanted to apply for that I felt like would, provide the type of training and, educational caliber that I wanted. And so had applied for both of those schools and then decided all right, I'm going to wait. I'm going to pray. I'm going to, see what God does. And early in the spring, even late winter, I ended up hearing from, which just so you know, both of the schools, one of them was maybe a little less than 2 hours from where I lived at the time. And so, of course, my parents loved that idea, not too far away. And then the other one was up in the Chicago area. Didn't know anybody up there. It was probably a good 5 hours away. And so that concerned my parents a little bit more, but they're like, we want you to go where you want to go and where you feel like God is leading, that type of thing. So waited to hear. And so I finally did hear back from one of the schools, and it was the one that was a little bit closer. And I found out that I got in. So I was really, really excited about that and started to kind of go through the process to look into what it would look like to begin to attend there. And I actually found out that there was a pretty significant scholarship that you could apply for and even compete for. And I actually ended up, getting into that process and actually won the scholarship. It was something like $5,000 a year renewable for every year that you're attending there, which my parents were pretty pleased with that. They liked that I had done that. But something as, we had kind of gone along, because I began to think gosh, even with winning that scholarship, it's it seems like doors are being opened, right? This is potentially where God wants me to go. One problem, I had not heard back from this other school yet. All my friends were hearing back from all the schools they applied to and things like that. And there's this one school that just, for whatever reason, were taking forever to get back to me. And so I found two ideas begin to develop in me very prominently. One, I began to become more and more concerned that I wouldn't get into that other school, which, truth be told, I wanted to go to that one a little bit more, the one that was up in the Chicago area. But I was becoming more and more concerned that I was not going to get into it. So I felt this compulsion to just say yes to this other school. It's already a good setup. Clearly, God has provided, and there's some open doors, and maybe you haven't heard from this other school for a reason because you're supposed to take this one. I felt that compulsion of I haven't heard from them, so I should take this. So that was the first thing I began to feel. Second thing, I became utterly convinced that that was not what I was supposed to do. And that was frustrating. I just, for some reason, deep in my gut and the core of my being, knew that other school I hadn't heard back from, that was where I was supposed to go. No question. And so I actually, against all advice, against all good sense apparently, I turned down the other school before I knew whether I had got into the one I wanted to go to. That was an interesting conversation with my parents, because they're because I told them, I was hey, I ended up turning down such and such. And they're really? So you got into the other one? No. So you're the one that you got into, you're turning down? Yeah. The one you got the $5,000 scholarship? Yeah. But you don't know whether you got into the other one? No. What do you do if you don't get into the other one? I don't know. I'm like, yep, that's it. That basically sums up my situation. And I could tell they had like a little stress aneurysm right in that moment. But the thing is, I've learned, in that moment, just where I felt God was leading me, that the life of faith can sometimes appear as foolishness to the rest of the world. But God calls us to it anyway. And so we're starting this series today that's going to last for the rest of the month, called Pass the Torch. And the reason why we're calling it the Pass the Torch is because we're going to spend the whole month looking in the book of Hebrews, specifically the 11th chapter of Hebrews. Because if you know anything about the Bible, in Hebrews chapter 11 is kind of a famous chapter because it's almost like a roll call of faith, where it's just this explanation of hero after hero after hero in the Old Testament of these amazing things that God did through them. And it always starts each conversation by faith. By faith, this person did this. By faith, this person did that. And that faith is kind of the centrality of that chapter. And so what we're going to do is we're going to spend the next month looking at some key stories in that chapter, and to show that in a lot of ways, this faith that we're all supposed to have for God is in essence this torch that we carry. Because I think one of the reasons why Hebrews 11 was written the way that it was is because it was written to a group of Christians who were suffering and being persecuted and going through a hard time. And many of them were wanting to quit. Some of them had already given up. And the writer of Hebrews was saying, don't give up. Remember, the whole story of the people of God is the people of God going through the exact same things that you're going through right now. So don't give up. And here's all the stories to show you what happens when you don't give up. So we want to pass this torch of faith has been passed from generation to generation for thousands of years, and it's now been passed to you, and you have to ask yourself, what are you going to do with it? Are you going to snuff it out, or are you going to pass it on? And so that's what we're going to look at. Because we see that faith is central to the spiritual life. Hebrews 11:6 says this, starting verse 1, it says, now faith is confidence in what we hope for, an assurance about what we do not see. This is what the ancients were commended for. He's kind of setting up the stage. He's going to begin to look through the stories of the ancients and why they were commended for their faith, that this is kind of a central thing, that faith is kind of at the centrality of it. And he goes on in verse 6 to say why. He says, and without faith, it is impossible to please God. So like trusting God for stuff, not optional. It's not it'd be good if you did, but if not, God can still, do whatever. He's saying, no, without faith, it is impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. And see, it's really important that you understand, the way faith is defined here, it's not mental assent or mental agreement with an idea. For many of people, even in our culture, and maybe in this room right now, who think I agree with the idea that Jesus died on the cross for my sins. I agree with the idea that he was supposedly God and rose on the dead on the third day. I believe that idea. But see, the word believe, the word faith, in the New Testament, it has this aggressive, active tone to it that says that, essentially it means to cling to adhere to, meaning I believe this idea so furiously that I'm literally holding on to it like a life jacket in a stormy sea. That I'm not trusting in my own abilities, my own, righteousness to make myself right with God, but I'm clinging to the cross, the idea that Jesus rose from the dead for my sins, because without it, I have nothing. I have no way to make myself right with God. And so I'm clinging to it, putting all of my hope and trust in this idea. That's what it means to believe, and it affects your behavior. It affects the way that you live. It changes you. This is the type of ruthless trust in God that is talked about in the scriptures. And so I want to zero in today on one particular story that's told at the beginning of Hebrews 11 about, and it probably shouldn't be a surprise that we start with this story, about the one who is kind of considered the father of our faith, and that is Abraham. Hebrews 11:8, the author recounts Abraham's story for us. He says this: by faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place where he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. By faith, he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob. So you even see right there, he's hinting at a next generation thing, saying there's a passing of the torch in this. He said, who were heirs with him of the same promise. The same faith would be passed on to his children. For he was looking forward to a city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. So it's like the thing Abraham is pursuing, it's not just about the thing itself, that there's something bigger, there's something better, there's something elusive beyond just this thing, this place he's going, that God is wanting to do something in and through Abraham. And he saw that, maybe far off. The scriptures say that they didn't even end up inheriting the promise themselves, but they saw it far off, but they went for it anyway. So for those of you who are maybe in the room, you don't know Bible stories, you aren't familiar with the scriptures, I'll give you just a little recap of who Abraham is and why his story is important for Christians even today. See, Abraham was an Aramaean man who lived about 4,000 years ago in an area that was known as Mesopotamia. Now, of course, I assume you all know where Mesopotamia is. That's a discussion we have on a normal basis, right? We all talk about Mesopotamia. No, like it's an ancient land from a very, very ancient time that would be the equivalent of probably modern-day Iraq in the Middle East. Iraq, Iran, somewhere around there. It was a very fertile area where civilizations kind of initially built up. So he lived in this area, among a pagan people during a pagan time. But then one day, this God, the God of the universe who created everything, spoke to this man in the middle of a pagan society and said this. Genesis 12:1 says, the Lord had said to Abram, go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. So Abram went as the Lord had told him. Now, this is always a strange text to me for some reason. Because if you understand Aramaean people and Mesopotamia in that area is they were polytheists. They worshiped many, many different gods. And we know from history and archaeology and things like that Yahweh, who would become the God of Israel, was not one of those gods. So literally a God Abraham didn't know spoke to him one day and said, hey, I want you to take a trip. I want you to go to this land, and I'm not going to tell you where you're going. And I'm not going to tell you what's going to happen when you get there, but if you do, I'll bless you. And Abraham says, okay. Can you imagine that? Just this ruthless trust, this ruthless, belief in God. Because, even in the ancient world, where you lived, where your family was kind of set up, now, we live in a very mobile society where, kids grow up and they sometimes move to different countries, much less different states or different towns. But up until really a generation or two ago, you didn't leave your home area. You stayed near your family. It was very strange to move far away from where your family was camped at, because where your family was at is where safety and security is. Because up until just a generation or two ago, you did what your parents did. If your dad worked a job, that was the trade that you would take on. If he was a farmer, you were a farmer. If he was a welder, you would be a welder. That was a very common thing to do. And so to say to Abraham, leave your family, leave your town, leave everything you know, he's saying to him, leave your comfort, leave your security, leave everything that you could trust in your own resources, and I am going to do this new thing in you. And see, this is the thing about faith. It shows us that faith means trusting God even when there's no immediate evidence. And we do this a lot. It's easy for us to be like, oh, God, show me a sign and I'll go, or help me understand what's happening so I can show me what you're doing. And granted, that's fine to ask those questions. That's fine to cry out to God to seek clarity, because oftentimes he does give those answers. He does show you what he's doing, that he does oftentimes long to show us what he's wanting to do in our lives. But if we refuse to move forward until we have all the answers of all the questions we've asked, that's not faith. That's saying, God, I need to figure you out before I trust you. I need some evidence. I need some explanation before moving forward. It's not faith. See, Hebrews 11:1 doesn't say faith is the confidence in what we understand. It doesn't say it's the assurance of what we've already seen. Faith requires risk. Faith requires trust. It means something that when we walk forward without all of the answers, that requires something of us. There's an element of risk and danger. This is why, like, when God told Abraham, this God that, as far as we know, he didn't even necessarily know or worship at the time, to give up everything he knew and loved and valued and trusted in, leave all that behind and go to this place I'll show you. He's almost like saying to Abraham, like, hey, like, Abraham, you want to go camping for a while? It's like, how long is a while? The rest of your life. Okay. Like, it's insanity. But he said yes. And that's why it said he was commended for his faith, because he stepped out with radical trust. Can you imagine how foolish Abraham would have looked to his family? Leaving the family trade, leaving the land, the city that, maybe, who knows, dozens and dozens of generations of our family have lived in up till this point, and I'm just going to pull up stakes and go to a land that I don't even know necessarily where I'm going. I'm just going to go, and at some point we're going to pop up a tent and live there. Like, that doesn't make any sense. And this is how, honestly, this was how my parents responded to me a little bit. Like, I could tell they were struggling because they wanted to know, which of course I know they were paying for it, so I get it. Like, I understand the desire to know, the desire to understand, the desire to have hard and fast numbers. Like, I get that. But sometimes the life of faith pushes beyond some of those things. And there has to be an element of risk, an element of trust, even if I looked foolish to others. And that's the thing, is faith sometimes risks looking foolish to other people. Like, I've thought this for a long time, and I've even said this to people at some point, so I'm just going to say it all to you now. Like, if you want to live a life that is like all the time safe, all the time comfortable, and there's no risk, there's no danger, you're never going to come up with any sort of opposition or challenge or anything like that, don't follow Jesus. Like, seriously. I want everybody I come across to know and to love and to follow Jesus, but I'm not going to lie about the risk of it, lie about the cost of it to get someone to do it. Because when I do that, they're not really following Jesus. They're following their own version of Jesus. They're following a false god then. And I don't want anybody to be guilty of idolatry because of me. So the thing is, you want to follow Jesus? There's going to be challenges. He's going to ask you to step out in faith sometimes, do things that are way out of your comfort zone, way out of your skill set, way beyond your ability to endure. But he says, but I'm with you always to the very end of the age. I will enable you to do the impossible if you follow me. He may call you to, I'm going to give beyond my current ability. I'm going to serve beyond my current capacity. And people may roll their eyes or question you, but man, if you know it's in line with God's will, if you know it's in line with God's word, go for it. Like, don't give up. Trust ruthlessly, believe relentlessly, keep the faith, and pass the torch. Because see, sometimes God calls us to believe things that don't even seem good, even for ourselves. Sometimes we're called to live in a way that almost looks like it's putting ourselves at disadvantage, like it might actually be even bad for ourselves when we step into it. And we see this like in Abraham's story. In verse 17, it continues on. It says, by faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had embraced the promises. I love that phrase. Because God didn't tell him why. He didn't tell him what was going to happen. There was very little God told Abraham when he called him into the promised land. But he did promise. He says, hey, there's a lot of unknowns here, but I will tell you this. If you say yes, I will bless you. I will make you a great nation. I will multiply you out. Kings will come from your line if you listen to me, if you obey me, if you trust me in this. And so it says he embraced the promises. It says was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead. And so in a manner of speaking, he did receive Isaac back from death. Now think about this. In this story where God calls Abraham to literally sacrifice his son, he's asking Abraham to give up the one thing in which all the promises, all the good things that God was bringing into his life, all the things he'd promised he'd do, all of that was centered and focused on this son, because you can't become a great nation if you don't have children. You can't have descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky or the sand in the seashore if you don't have kids. You can't have kings in your line if there is no line. And so he's like this one kid that, consequently, we always forget about this because we think like, oh yeah, like God promised he'd have a kid, and then 3 chapters later he had a kid, or 4 or 5 chapters later he had a kid. We don't realize that 4 chapters covered 25 years. It took Abraham and Sarah 25 years before the promise was fulfilled. And so after waiting for 25 years, they finally received what God had promised, the beginnings of saying God is making good on everything he said he would do. And now God's like, now give it up. Would you? Would you give it up? Would you give the one thing that God has promised to you that you finally received? Would you give that up if he asked you to? How would you respond if God began to take away the very thing he promised to you long, long ago? Now, the story of Abraham sacrificing Isaac is kind of a problematic text. And I know that it's easy, like in a sermon, to like kind of airbrush over it and like, oh yeah, blah, 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 like this reason, that reason, but let's move on. But then there are people who aren't Christians, who don't trust God, who don't believe, that they're like, wait a minute, like he asked him to kill his own son? Why would he do that? And we don't really address it. And we realize like we need to talk about this because they're talking about it. And if we don't feel like we have an understanding of what's really going on here, they're just going to be like, see, they're just like unthinking sheep and write you off and walk away. I don't want anything to do with blind faith where you just accept stuff because the guy up on stage tells you to. No, let's talk about this text because it's very, very interesting. There's so much here because you think about like, didn't God actually call Abraham out of a land, out of a culture, out of a people who sacrificed their children? Like that was a common thing in the Canaanite nations, is they would oftentimes to their various gods sacrifice children as, some sort of a worship or offering. So God is calling Abraham out of that, saying, I'm calling you apart, I'm calling you to live different, to be different. Now I want you to kill your son. It's like, what do you do with that? It's an interesting text. Now, granted, from a biblical historical point of view, I could argue that technically this is before, because I've heard people say like, God will never, like how you can know whether God's speaking to you or not is God will never ask you to do something that's not like, that contradicts his word. Like God's not going to ask you to murder someone because it says in the scriptures not to murder. So like that's how you can know whether it's God speaking to you or not. But right here, he's asking him to murder his son. What do you do with that? Now, granted, I could argue, well, this was before the giving of the law, that this hasn't been revealed yet. The law hasn't been given. The commandment has not been given yet. So like giving a God a pass. But it's like, well, the thing we need to realize, like God's word, his scriptures, like this is not like a rule book that God like pinned himself in to some sort of behavior. Like this is called the revelation of who God is, meaning like this speaks to God's character. So this wasn't like, well, I want to behave this way, but since I already said this thing, then I guess I have to do it. No, he's saying everything in here represents my heart and my character, who I am. So then what do you do with this text? Because this is a question about God's character. Is God the type of God who would genuinely want you to murder your own kid? Is that what he's like? I'll answer it with 2 points. One, first of all, and I think we need to realize this, because oftentimes we read stories and we want to like put ourselves in the story and be like, well, what God did to Abraham, he's going to do to me and things like that. And I need to realize Abraham's story is unique. It's unique in the sense that he is making a special covenant with Abraham that we would all be able to someday through Jesus be able to be included in. But he's uniquely in this story making this unique covenant with this man. So I think the story is a little bit unique in this sense. But the other thing that I think is even more important is if you read the text, and this is why don't just hear the story be told by someone, read the text yourself. Because there's a couple things as I read through this and thought through this, I noticed some things that I'd never noticed before. Because the truth is, I think God already knew Abraham's heart, and the test was more for Abraham's benefit than God's. And here's what I mean by that. So is God the type of God who would command, one of us to like kill our children for him? No. Simple answer. But I will say this, and I think this is looking at the picture, looking at the story kind of big picture. God is not the type of God who would have a parent kill his child, but he is the type of God who will cause you to kill off anything that you love more than him. You tracking with me on that? God will cause you to let go, to kill off, to remove the things in your life that you love more than him. And so I think about this story, what this story represents, what was happening here, what the test of Abraham's heart was, is do you love the promise more than the one who gives the promise? And that's an element of faith. Faith means trusting the promiser, not just the promise. I mean, yeah, I can invoke the promises of God for something to happen, but at the end of the day, the promises don't mean anything if I don't trust the character of the promiser. Trust that he's going to make good on the things that he promised. And I think in this text, we see that Abraham, he trusted the promiser. And I'll give you a couple examples to show what I mean. I think this test was meant to reveal Abraham's heart to Abraham. I think God already knew. He already knew Abraham's heart. And he's wanting to actually, in a very visceral, scary, bloody way, reveal to Abraham what was really in his heart. Because we see in Genesis 22:5, when Abraham is taking his son up to be sacrificed, he tells some of his servants, like, hey, stay at the foot of the mountain because we're going up to do the sacrifice now. And this is what he says. He says, we will worship and then we will come back to you. See, there's an assumption in that text. Abraham's saying, we're both coming back. Like he knew. He's like, I don't know how this is all going to work out, but somehow we are going to come back. And then further down in verse 8, whenever his son begins, because you can imagine walking up that mountain and your son like, Dad, what are we sacrificing? Like, we don't have a lamb, we don't have a goat, what are we going to do? And he's asking where the lamb for the sacrifice was, and Abraham replied, verse 8, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. Now, whether you realize it or not, and it's kind of a shadow, it's kind of a glimmer, it's kind of a foretelling, but that's the gospel right there. You realize that? God is not going to ask you to kill your own son and then he has to raise him from the dead, because God is going to give his own son to die and then raise him from the dead. So you don't have to offer your kid because God's going to offer his freely, willingly, to pay for our sins. But see, even in this moment leading up to the sacrifice, Abraham, he's kind of talking this out, and he didn't know how it was going to happen. He didn't know how this was going to play out. He didn't know God was going to bring a goat along to do this. And so it begs the question, did Abraham expect God to intervene in some way? Because in Hebrews 11:19, it says, Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead. And so in some manner of speaking, he did receive Isaac back from death. So the whole time Abraham's thinking I don't know how this is going to play out. I don't have all the answers. I know I look foolish coming up here with my son, but I trust the promiser more than the promise. And I know somehow God is still going to work out his purposes in this situation. So I'm going to obey God and trust him and leave the results to him. And that is brutal, ruthless trust. Now, on the flip side of that coin, can you imagine what Isaac must have been thinking in the midst of that? We always tell that story and we think it from the perspective of Abraham. But what about Isaac? Can you imagine being this I think it says how old he is, but I don't remember, close to teenage, somewhere 12 years old or something like that. I can't remember how old he is. But in the midst of this thinking is he really going to kill me? I wonder how long it took before he connected the dots, and then even seeing the knife about to come down and then an angel stopping him. Can you imagine what that conversation would have been like going down the mountain? Dad, what just happened? What the heck just happened? He's like, I don't know, son, God provided. He's like, are you serious? God provided? That was it? To see the level of faith in your father, how could that not pass on to the son? Like, I think that was instructive for Isaac as well, of what it means to brutally, ruthlessly, with your whole heart, trust God with everything you have and just leave the results to him. And we see that passed on from generation to generation, so much so that there's a verse I want to read. I love this verse so much. One of my favorite verses in the Old Testament. This is in Deuteronomy 26. This was written to the people of Israel. This is probably 500 or 600 years after Abraham has long been dead and gone, and Isaac and Jacob and the 12 sons of Israel, all of that had passed away. Israel has become a numerous people. They were in slavery for hundreds of years, and now they're being brought into the promised land, finally living in the abundance of everything that was promised to Abraham all of those, all those centuries and centuries ago. And this is what it says. Deuteronomy 26 is talking about when you bring your offering into the temple. It says, this is what you should do. I love this so much. Deuteronomy 26:5. Then you shall declare before the Lord your God, my father was a wandering Aramaean, and he went down into Egypt with a few people and lived there and became a great nation, powerful and numerous. But the Egyptians mistreated us and made us suffer, subjecting us to harsh labor. Then we cried out to the Lord, the God of our ancestors, and the Lord heard our voice and saw our misery, toil, and oppression. So the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, with great terror and with signs and wonders. He brought us to this place and gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. And now, I bring the first fruits of the soil that you, Lord, have given me. Hundreds of years later, bringing their offering into the temple. They're living in the promised land. And they said that when you give your gifts to God, you invoke the name of your father Abraham and say, my father was a wandering Aramaean. He didn't know how things were going to turn out. At times things were scary. They were tough. He didn't know what was going to happen. And yet he trusted you. And right now I am living in the fullness and abundance of those promises. And so now I bring this offering to you, God, to say that right now in my life, there are some things I don't know how they're going to turn out. Money may be tight. There may be issues in my family. There's problems with my work that I'm not sure what the future looks like for me. But I know I can look back at that wandering Aramaean and say that just like God, he trusted God and God provided for him, I believe the same thing is going to happen for me today. So I bring my gift to you, God, and say, God, help me to trust you like my father Abraham did. Isn't that beautiful? Can you imagine? It was just maybe a crazy idea. I was just thinking about this. Man, what if the next time we take up the offering, the bucket's going through the aisles, what if just to yourself, when you put the envelope in, or maybe you give online, so you're at home, you're on the computer, you're doing your little clickety-click, and when you do it, you say, just whisper under your breath, my father was a wandering Aramaean. Give. Bucket's going by, my father was a wandering Aramaean. I'm going to trust you, God, like he trusted you. God, help me to have the type of faith that he had in you, that he trusted you, that he didn't know how things were going to turn out, and yet you provided for him. You brought him into abundance, and God, I believe you're going to do the same for me. So my father was a wandering Aramaean. God, I'm going to trust you like Abraham did. What would our community look like if we were a people willing to risk for God? What could we accomplish? What might God do in our midst if we said yes to him in the face of fear and we're willing to go with reckless abandon, regardless of whether we look foolish to people, regardless of whether we had all the answers or not, regardless of whether it seemed like the promises were about to blow up in our face, to say, no, I trust the promiser more than I do the promise. So I'm going to say yes to you, God, every single time, no matter what it costs me. Use me. Well, I'll tell you what can happen when you step out in faith. See, despite all the warnings of my parents, despite my own fears and reservations, I ended up waiting on the Lord to hear back from Wheaton College. And about 6 or 8 weeks went by, and I just heard nothing. I was so scared. I was starting to get into April, and I'm like, am I going to be going to school anywhere? I don't know. And finally, I got that I remember I got home from a run and I got the acceptance letter and it was thick. And I remember like running around the yard saying, they don't give thick rejection letters. They don't give thick rejection letters. And of course I opened it up and it's like, we're pleased to announce that you have been accepted for admission to Wheaton College. And I just remember like falling on my knees and being like, yes, Lord, like, I knew it. I knew it. You told me. Nobody believed me. I knew it. And so, of course, my parents were like, oh, wow. Like, they realized like they got to see the faithfulness of God right in the midst of that. And so I ended up moving to a city that I knew nobody, didn't know anybody there, never been there before. And I remember the first day whenever we were moving in, there was a guy who helped me and my parents move my stuff into my dorm room, and his name was Paul Lewis. He became my best friend while I was there and would one day become the best man in my wedding. And I remember pretty soon after starting there, he told me, he's like, hey, there's this church that I've been going to. It's about 20 minutes north of the school. It's kind of off the beaten path. Not a lot of students go there, but like I've just really loved it and would, just want to see if you want to come with me. Wish we were becoming close friends. So I was like, yeah, let's do it. And so while I was there, started attending, they had a young adult ministry I got involved with, and I ended up meeting a guy who was one of the leaders there. His name was John Peacock. His dad was the senior pastor there. Got to know John better and found out later that he actually worked part-time at Willow Creek Community Church. And so we developed a relationship. We were actually on a worship team together for a while, but by the time I graduated, he actually had taken over the young adult ministry at Willow and was kind of revamping the whole thing from the ground up. And he had asked me, hey, like, what would you think about coming on staff with me and interning in our ministry? So I was like, yeah, I would love that. So did that, joined the team, and little did I know that there was a woman on that team also interning named Lindsay Martin, who I would end up falling in love with and marrying. And then in the midst of that, as my internship was closing out, a friend of mine who was kind of connected to Willow and various connections told me about this guy named Van Brooks. This church in Effingham, Illinois. And I knew Effingham because I lived in Olney. I was close. But he's like, yeah, this church, New Hope Church, like, you got to come check it out. Like, God's doing awesome stuff there. You just got to meet this guy. Like, he's a weird dude. You just got to meet him. So I was like, okay, like, yeah, I'd love to meet him. Like, I always love seeing what ministries are doing. So I remember emailing Van and saying, like, hey, like, because of ministry and stuff like that, there's this one weekend in September. It's the only weekend that I can come. Like, would it be cool if I just came? I'd just love to see New Hope and see what's going on. I've heard a lot of good things. And like 15 minutes later, he responded back and he's like, hey, what would you think about speaking that week? I was like, what? I'm like, okay, like pulpit 101 is like, don't offer your pulpit to someone you don't know. Like, because I could like bust out the snakes and like, hey, instead of communion, we're going to pass poison around the room. Like, good times. Thanks for having me. And so I was like, okay, I guess so. And so I came and I spoke, and instant connection with the staff. I remember multiple people saying stuff, and even there was someone on staff who had actually, like, they said to me, I think it was between the services, where they said, you should be on staff with us, which I was like, whoa. Like, I'm not even done with both services yet. Wait till both services are over, and then we'll talk. And 2 weeks later, I end up getting a call from Van, and, he offers me this associate pastor position and begins to kind of talk through that. We go through the interview process, and so then later that year in January, I end up coming on staff, and 11 years later, I am still here today. You can't get rid of me. Now, I tell that really, really long story, forgive me, for a reason. Because, see, I believe at the core of my being that God is faithful, he can be trusted, that he has plans for everybody, and that the thing that I've learned, it's not about these like huge, giant, crazy leaps of faith, that oftentimes it's these tiny little steps of faith, that if you're faithful in those little things, that can snowball into major life change. The reason I tell those stories, because I've thought about this a lot over the year. Had I not said no to that other school and yes to Wheaton, I would never move to Chicago. Had I never moved there, I never would have met Paul. Had I never met Paul, I never would have gone to that church. Had I never gone to that church, I never would have met John. Had I never met John, I wouldn't have interned at Willow. Had I never interned at Willow, I wouldn't have met my wife. And had I not interned there, I would have never been connected with Van. I would have never come here. And I wouldn't be here 11 years later to tell you that God is faithful, that God can be trusted, and you should put just everything of who you are into that bucket because he's faithful. He can be trusted. He will move in your life. I believe that with all my heart. God can be trusted. And all you got to do is take simple steps of faith. Say, move all the chips and say, God, I'm all in. That thing I've been struggling with, I'll do it. He can be trusted. Will you stand with me? Oftentimes, we don't really get the opportunity to really determine what those steps are because we don't have the space to listen. And so what I want to do is I want to just take this time. Lucas is going to come up and just kind of take us through a song. But what I want to do is just to give you a little bit of breathing room, a little bit of space to just dialogue with God, just to talk with God, to reflect on who he is and what role your relationship with him, if you even have one, what that looks like and what little step of faith God might be calling you to, some way to step out, to live in some way, to take some sort of step to where God can begin to make major life change. And one of the things that I'm thinking of is, gosh, there may be some people here that you don't know what I'm talking about when I say steps of faith and all those types of things, because the truth is, you've never even made that initial step to trust Jesus, to put your faith in him, to know that, man, he died for me, for my sins, for everything I've ever done. And he rose from the dead on the third day, able to wipe the slate clean with God and start over with him, to be reconciled to God if I will just put my trust in him. If I turn from my old way of living and turn to live in his kingdom, he can make me a new person. You've never done that before? You can make that step today to invite Jesus into your life. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to give you a little space to just reflect and think and to ask God, what is that next step of faith for me? What does that look like? And listen, because he'll speak to you if you let him.